When we look closely at self-neglect, we begin to see that it is rarely about laziness or lack of discipline. More often, it is a quiet language spoken by a wounded inner world. When someone stops taking care of themselves, the body and mind are communicating something that words have failed to express. It is a silent cry, not for attention, but for understanding. In many cases, the individual does not even realize they are asking for help. They simply feel a deep sense of heaviness, disconnection, or fatigue that slowly erodes their relationship with themselves. Human beings are wired to express pain. If pain cannot move outward through conversation, tears, or connection, it turns inward. Self-neglect becomes one of the ways that unspoken pain finds a form. Skipping meals, ignoring rest, neglecting health, or abandoning routines are not random acts, they are signals. Signals that something within feels unseen, unheard, or overwhelmed. The mind, unable to articulate distress, chooses absence. Absence from care, absence from presence, absence from the body itself. Often, this pattern begins subtly. A person may start by postponing small acts of care, telling themselves they will do it later. Over time, later becomes never. And beneath this behavior lies a quiet belief. What I feel doesn't matter enough. This belief may not be conscious, but it is powerful. It shapes behavior more strongly than motivation ever could. When the inner world feels ignored, the outer self follows suit. Many people who neglect themselves have learned, at some point in their lives, that expressing pain was unsafe or ineffective. Perhaps their emotions were dismissed, minimized, or met with criticism. Perhaps they learned early on that being strong meant being silent. Over time, the nervous system adapts. It learns to suppress signals of distress. And when distress has nowhere to go, it settles into the body as exhaustion, numbness, or disengagement. Self-neglect, then, is not a failure of character. It is an adaptation. It is the psyche's way of saying, I don't know how to ask for help, so I will disappear instead. Disappearing can feel safer than risking rejection or misunderstanding. And so the person withdraws, not only from others, but from themselves. There is also a deep fatigue associated with carrying unexpressed pain. When someone has been holding it together for too long, caring for themselves can feel like an impossible task. Even simple acts, drinking water, resting, tending to the body, can feel overwhelming. This is not because the person doesn't value themselves, but because their inner resources are depleted. The system is tired of surviving. In this state, neglect can feel strangely comforting. It requires less effort than presence. It allows the individual to avoid feeling what has been buried. And yet, the cost is profound. Each act of neglect reinforces the belief that one is not worthy of care. The silence grows louder. The cry for help becomes deeper, even as it remains unspoken. What is important to understand is that this cry is not dramatic. It is not loud. It does not demand. It whispers. It shows up in small ways: postponing doctor visits, ignoring hunger, neglecting sleep, losing interest in personal well-being. These behaviors are not the problem, they are the message. And the message is always the same: something inside is hurting and does not know how to be held. The first step toward healing is not fixing these behaviors. It is listening to them. Listening without judgment. Listening with curiosity. Asking gently, what part of me is asking to be seen? When we approach self-neglect with compassion instead of criticism, the body begins to soften, the nervous system begins to feel safer, and in that safety, words may slowly emerge. This awareness is powerful. It transforms neglect from something shameful into something meaningful. It allows us to see that beneath every act of self-abandonment is a longing for connection, a longing to feel valued, a longing to rest from the burden of carrying everything alone. And as this understanding settles in, a subtle shift occurs. The inner world realizes it no longer needs to scream through silence. It can begin to speak gently, honestly, and with trust. Self-neglect does not begin with behavior, it begins with disconnection. Long before a person stops caring for their body, their health, or their emotional needs, they have quietly drifted away from their own inner experience. This disconnection is subtle, almost invisible, And because of that, it often goes unnoticed. People assume that neglect comes from not knowing what to do, but the truth is deeper. It comes from not feeling oneself anymore. When someone is connected to their inner world, care happens naturally. Hunger is felt and honored. Fatigue is noticed and respected. Emotions rise and are acknowledged. But when that connection weakens, signals lose their meaning. The body speaks, but the mind no longer listens. Over time, this creates a sense of living on autopilot, moving through days without presence, without intimacy with oneself. This disconnection often develops as a protective response. Many people learned early in life that feeling too much was unsafe. Maybe emotions led to conflict, rejection, or disappointment. Maybe sensitivity was misunderstood as weakness. So the mind learned to distance itself from sensation, from emotion, from need. This distancing helped them survive. It allowed them to function, to perform, to meet expectations. But survival is not the same as wholeness. As this pattern continues, the individual becomes more identified with roles and responsibilities than with inner truth. They know who they are supposed to be, but not who they are. They become skilled at taking care of others, meeting deadlines, fulfilling duties, while slowly abandoning their own internal signals. Self-care, in this state, feels foreign, even uncomfortable, because it requires returning to a self that has been ignored for a long time. The body, however, never stops communicating. It sends messages through tension, fatigue, cravings, and pain. But when the connection is weak, these messages are misinterpreted or dismissed. Hunger becomes an inconvenience. Exhaustion becomes normal. Emotional discomfort becomes something to push through. In this way, neglect is not intentional, it is the natural outcome of not being in relationship with oneself. There is also a quiet loss of self-trust that accompanies disconnection. When a person repeatedly ignores their own needs, a subconscious belief forms, I cannot rely on myself. This belief deepens the divide. It becomes easier to look outside for guidance, validation, and direction while the inner voice grows faint. Over time, people may feel confused about what they want, what they need, or what would truly nourish them. This is why advice and motivation often fail to address self-neglect. You can tell someone exactly how to take care of themselves, but if they are disconnected from their inner world, those instructions feel empty. Care cannot be forced. It arises from relationship, and when that relationship is fractured, the first step is not action, but reconnection. Reconnection does not require effort or discipline. It requires presence, a willingness to pause and notice, to ask simple questions without expecting immediate answers. What am I feeling right now? Where do I sense this in my body? What am I needing in this moment? These questions gently invite the self back into awareness. They signal safety. They say, you are allowed to exist here. As awareness returns, so does sensitivity. The body begins to feel again. Emotions begin to surface. At first, this can be uncomfortable. Disconnection protected the individual from pain, and reconnecting may reveal what has been suppressed, but within this discomfort is intelligence. The body knows how to guide healing when it is listened to. Slowly, self-care stops feeling like a task and starts feeling like a response. A response to what is actually happening inside. Rest becomes a natural choice when fatigue is honored. Nourishment becomes intuitive when hunger is felt. Boundaries emerge when emotions are respected. Care flows not from obligation, but from attunement. The journey out of self-neglect is not about becoming better at managing life. It is about coming home to oneself. It is about restoring the relationship between awareness and experience, between mind and body, between thought and feeling. And in that reunion, something profound shifts. When you reconnect with yourself, care is no longer something you try to do. It becomes something that happens naturally. Long before self-neglect appears in adult life, a quiet story about worthiness is often written in the early years. This story is not created through words alone, but through experiences, patterns, and emotional atmospheres. A child learns who they are allowed to be by how their needs are received. When care, attention, comfort are given conditionally, the child does not question the environment, they question themselves. And from this questioning, beliefs are formed that can last a lifetime. If a child's emotional needs are consistently minimized, rushed, or ignored, the nervous system adapts. The child learns that expressing need leads to discomfort or disconnection. Over time, the safest choice becomes self-silencing. Needs are pushed aside. Feelings are swallowed. This is not a conscious decision, it is an intelligent survival response. The child learns how to belong by asking for less. As this pattern settles in, a subtle belief takes root. My needs are a burden. This belief may never be spoken, but it shapes everything. It influences how the person relates to their body, their emotions, and their sense of deserving. Self-care later in life can feel undeserved or even selfish, not because the person lacks compassion, but because compassion was never mirrored back to them when they needed it most. Early conditioning also teaches children how to measure their value. When love is offered primarily for achievement, obedience, or emotional restraint, the child learns that worth must be earned. Rest becomes something to justify. Care becomes something to postpone. Pleasure becomes something to feel guilty about. The inner world becomes organized around performance rather than presence. As adults, these individuals may appear capable, responsible, even self-sacrificing. But beneath the surface, there is often a deep discomfort with receiving. They may give generously to others while neglecting themselves, not out of kindness alone, but out of an ingrained belief that their own needs are secondary. This imbalance feels normal to them because it mirrors the emotional landscape they grew up in. The subconscious mind holds on to these early lessons with remarkable loyalty. Even when circumstances change, the old patterns remain active. An adult may have freedom, resources, and awareness, yet still feel uneasy when turning attention inward. The body may relax, but the mind whispers, "You should be doing more." The moment of rest becomes filled with tension because rest was never associated with safety. This is how self-neglect becomes normalized. It does not feel like harm, it feels familiar. And familiarity is powerful. The nervous system prefers what it knows, even if what it knows is uncomfortable. Choosing oneself can feel like betrayal, not of others, but of the old identity that learned how to survive by staying small. Healing these patterns does not require blaming the past. Conditioning is not about fault, it is about understanding. When we see that our beliefs about worthiness were formed in response to our environment, compassion naturally arises. We realize that the voice saying, "You don't deserve care," is not truth, it is memory. As awareness deepens, we can begin to gently question these inherited beliefs. What if my needs are not too much? What if care is not something I have to earn? What if rest is not laziness but intelligence? These questions are not meant to be answered immediately. They are meant to soften the inner rigidity that keeps old patterns in place. When the subconscious begins to feel safety in presence rather than performance, a shift occurs. The body starts to accept care without resistance. The mind begins to release its grip on constant self-monitoring. Slowly, the individual learns a new way of being, one where worth is inherent, not conditional. This relearning is subtle but profound. It happens in moments of choosing to rest without justification, to nourish without guilt, to listen without rushing. Each act of care becomes a quiet statement, "I am allowed to matter." And in that realization, self-neglect begins to dissolve, not through force, but through remembrance of one's own worth. Emotional exhaustion does not announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly, accumulating over time, disguised as responsibility, resilience, and endurance. Many people believe that when they are tired, what they need is motivation. But deep emotional exhaustion does not drain motivation alone, it dulls sensitivity itself. And when sensitivity fades, numbness takes its place. In that numbness, self-care no longer feels meaningful, it feels irrelevant. When a person has been carrying too much for too long, the nervous system enters a state of conservation. It is no longer oriented toward growth or nourishment, but towards survival. In this state, the system prioritizes getting through the day over listening inward. Feelings become muted. Desires fade into the background. The inner world grows quiet, not because everything is fine, but because there is no energy left to process what is not. This is why telling an emotionally exhausted person to try harder or take better care of yourself often misses the point. Exhaustion does not respond to pressure, it responds to permission. The permission to stop striving, the permission to feel without fixing, the permission to be present without performing. Emotional exhaustion often develops in people who are deeply conscientious, those who care, those who feel responsible for others' well being, those who have learned to stay strong no matter what. Over time, strength becomes a habit rather than a choice. And when strength is habitual, vulnerability feels unfamiliar, even threatening. So instead of feeling what is heavy, the individual shuts down sensation altogether. In this shutdown, neglect becomes passive rather than intentional. Meals are skipped not out of indifference, but because hunger is barely registered. Rest is delayed not because it is undesired, but because the body no longer signals its need clearly. Emotional cues that once guided behavior are now muffled. The person is functioning, but not feeling. Numbness can feel like relief at first. It creates distance from pain. It allows the person to keep going. But over time, numbness becomes its own form of suffering. Without access to feeling, there is no access to joy, curiosity, or care. Life becomes flat. Self-care, which once might have felt soothing, now feels empty, like a gesture without resonance. This state is often misunderstood. From the outside, the person may appear fine, productive, capable, even calm, but inside there is a quiet depletion, a sense of being disconnected from meaning. The inner voice that once said, "I need rest," or "I need support," has grown faint. And without that voice, the individual loses their compass. Emotional exhaustion also distorts perception. When someone is depleted, even small acts of care can feel overwhelming. Drinking water, taking a walk, or pausing to breathe can feel like too much effort. This is not because the person is resistant to care, but because their internal resources are low. Asking them to care for themselves is like asking a tired muscle to lift more weight. What is needed in this moment is not activation, but softness. Not solutions, but space. When the nervous system is allowed to settle, sensitivity begins to return naturally. Feeling does not need to be forced. It emerges when safety is restored. This is where compassion becomes essential. Not compassion as an idea, but compassion as a felt experience. The experience of being allowed to rest without guilt. The experience of being seen without expectation. The experience of not having to hold everything together. These experiences slowly reawaken the body's capacity to feel. As numbness begins to lift, emotions may surface gradually. Fatigue may be felt more clearly. Sadness may arise, even grief. This is not regression, it is reconnection. It is the system thawing after a long freeze. And within this thawing, care becomes possible again, not as a task, but as a response to what is actually felt. Self-care, in this context, is not about routines or discipline. It is about attunement. It is about noticing when the body needs gentleness rather than productivity. When the heart needs acknowledgement rather than solutions. When silence is more nourishing than action. When emotional exhaustion is met with understanding instead of urgency, numbness begins to soften. And as feeling returns, so does the natural impulse to care. And in that return, the body remembers that it was never broken, only tired.